This is Jared Casbaum with the December Patreon only video. It's so good to see you all. I know I haven't done one in a couple months, and I'm sorry, but let's get to it. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas. Again, for I think it's 20 right now, 18, 19 people that give me money every month for this. This is just ridiculous, and I'm so happy for you, and I'm so incredibly grateful. I just feel like I have to say that every time because the fact that there's even a small dent in my bank account that is filled with the money of people who just think like, hey, this guy should get some of it. This is crazy. Okay. Man, let's talk about what, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to talk about what books have really impacted my life just because I'm passionate about that. And then so maybe Christmas ideas. I don't know how to tie that in thematically. And then also I want to talk about my journaling technique just because I love it and it's benefited me a lot. I struggle with anxiety a lot. So some of this is also kind of influenced by just that understanding. And so the anxiety in my life has been not cured by any means. I don't know if it ever will be. I wake up a lot of days, nervous existentially and feel like I need to figure out how to become important. And books and journaling are ways that I can fight that. I can fight that as the core source of some of my anxiety. So what that looks like for me, what's books? Okay, the three books that have four. How do I want to do it? Let's do three. I might add a fourth, books that have influenced me in my life. Let's do four. Okay, number one. Well, let's go backwards. Number four. I would go with Art Needs No Justification by Hans Rookmaaker. Look it up. I'll add these links. It's a small book. It's a long essay where Hans Rookmaaker, he's a Christian art philosophy theologian. There's probably a better term for that than what I just used, where he actually goes through he kind of talks through this idea that a lot of institutionalized Christians, I would say I should use that word more than just conservative, but institutionalized Christians that often believe that art needs some sort of evangelistic or afterlife-focused justification for it to be worthwhile. And he argues from a biblical and Christian perspective that art is beautiful because it is. Art is good and true and beautiful as expression of God's holiness, as an expression of God's character. In the way of Tolkien, if you know Tolkien, he talks about how as we create works of art, we become sub-creators along with God. And I think he takes very much that philosophical approach. But, I know as a Christian and a comedian, I've been asked many, many times, like, oh, do you share the gospel in your act? And I'm always just like, I think that'd be kind of stupid if I did. I think that'd mean I'm either one, making fun of the gospel, which I don't want to do as a Christian because I think it's legitimately important, or two, I'm sharing the gospel and not being funny, which is not my job. You don't tell an accountant to stop accounting just to share the gospel, and I feel like that's kind of what that is. And people are like, well, you have a platform, and I want to use the platform 100%, and I don't have a big platform, and I'm a firm believer that if you're not using your platform when you're small, you won't use your platform when you're big. But I think the gospel is much more and more all-encompassing than just the afterlife, and it's much more encompassing than just do you share it, and it's much more encompassing than this serious message of a system of beliefs that we're trying to pass down. And I think that my jokes can be the gospel in the sense of good news and love, and telling the people in the audience through my hospitality and energy and jokes that they're welcome, they're wanted, they're desired to be in that audience. I'm going to go with number two. That's a really important book to me. I read that book about 3 years ago now. Long essay recommended by a podcast called Makers and Mystics, which you'll hear mentioned one more time in this because of a different one of my books. So I've reread that book many times, and he ends that book with the call. He says to weep, pray, think, act, in that order. So we weep about the state of the world, about our lives. We weep, we allow, what that means in my interpretation of the word, we allow the events of the world to impact us. We allow our emotions to legitimately get hit by what's happening in our lives. the world, the systems of inequality and oppression, but also our own sorrow and sadness and despair. And then we pray, meaning we give that to God and we ask for advice. We submit that. We look for help. We look for biblical understanding. We sit in His presence and allow the emotions to simmer within us so that we can actually gain a sense of stillness and trust in the Lord in the midst of those emotions. So we pray. Think, meaning how do we make better moves? How do we do anything artistically, governmentally, politically, institutionally? My brother, he designs pipes for poop. That's a massive benefit to society, and it's a way to love people, because I don't want the poop to stay in my bathroom. So we're thinking about solutions. But for me, I'm thinking about jokes. I'm thinking about ways to transmit messages across cultures, across our culture. We pray, think, and then act. So of course, then we execute. We got to do something. If we only do the first three and we don't do the last, you might feel holy, you might feel better, but if you're not loving people intentionally with your life and your words and your actions and your hospitality, it doesn't matter. I doubt I'm going to go into the other books quite much in depth, but that's art needs no justification. So, and that act is art, but the whole process is art. I think my third most impactful book in my life, I'm going to go with the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. I'll touch on a couple things really, really cool. The autobiography of Benjamin Franklin, he goes into, it's like a series of letters, which back then, so many books were really just a series of letters that they compile afterward. A series of letters to his son. Most scholars think he kind of mythologized his own come-up story, which is fine because it's still really enjoyable. But Ben Franklin is writing these letters to his son, and he is describing his own come-up story. He's describing when he's I think it's 2021, he's getting to Philadelphia for the first time. He literally has no money. He has 2 loaves of bread. He sleeps on the street, and then the next day he goes knocking on doors trying to find work. And that was the mentality I took when I came to LA. And I think it's been hard during the pandemic because I can't really apply that mentality. I feel like the pandemic, the thing that's taken away the most from me is the agency through which I can enact change in the world. And I feel like my avenues of that are significantly diminished, especially with my specific gifts and skill sets and opportunities that God has given me as one who loves to draw people together and connect. So that mindset has had to shift a little bit in the midst of the Ben Franklin. But Ben Franklin, he knocked on every door of every printer, which in Philadelphia, there were 3 at the time, and he apprenticed under one, and he became influential because of his printing press skills. And back then, the printing press was the social media. If you wanted a message to get out, other than speaking it or writing it, you went to a printer. You went to a printing press. So he was able to become the social media of his day and become the medium through which people express their ideas. So then he's also able to express his own ideas alongside them. And so by the time of the revolution, because he's the oldest founding father, by the time of the revolution, he's in his 60s. And he has all this social capital he's built up by being a person that is transmitting ideas and people rely on for truth. He talks through a lot of kind of very funny stories of him a little bit being manipulative to gain some of that influence, or not gain influence, but to transmit his ideas more effectively. Really beautiful, really funny to read. Number 2, I'm going to go with Holiness by J.C. Ryle, Christian Anglican from the 70s and 80s, were when these sermons were given that he compiled. The first half of the book was published back then, and then the second half of the book, decades later, it's significantly worse, but that first half of the book, there's a couple chapters, The Fight and the Cost. Just phenomenal sermons on following Jesus that have ridiculously impacted me. That's where I think that reading that book, I really fell in love with Hebrews, and specifically Hebrews 12, which has become my favorite chapter in the Bible, my favorite passage. He talks about, because that whole book really, the series of sermons really finds its core in it's Hebrews 12:14, where it says, strive for holiness without which no one will see the Lord. And he unpackages holiness not as a thing to strive for, to earn anything before God, but to strive after holiness as a means to understand and pursue and enjoy God's character. Because if God is holy, then our pursuit of holiness actually is a pursuit of enjoying God within that holiness. Totally shifted the paradigm that I feel like I was kind of brought up with the church that I grew up at. Shout out to anybody watching this from that church. And thank you for your support. And we all grow and we all learn, and I don't blame anybody specifically, but I think institutionally that's what I came up with, was a very, we got to be perfect because I don't want God to be mad at me, but rather I want to be holy because I want to know the character of the divine presence that exists in all things and within me. not in a pantheistic way, but in a way that God is in the tree. God is not the tree. I'm not there, but God is in the tree, and I believe that fully. I don't know why I went into that. It's not in that book whatsoever. Anglican priest, really good guy. One of the coolest Anglican old pastors I've ever read. Reading him and reading like N.T. Wright make it really hard to not kind of want to be Anglican. But also reading St. Athanasius and reading St. John of Chrysostom and reading some of those guys makes it really hard to not want to be Eastern Orthodox. So they've all got some beauties. Reading Thomas Merton makes it hard not to want to be Catholic. But of course reading Spurgeon makes it really hard to not want to be Baptist. Any modern Baptist can I put into that boat? No. I don't want to say that. I've had a couple really influential personal pastors to me, but not like institutional pastors, Baptists. Anyway, last top book of my life so far. If you know me at all, you know that I talk about this a lot, and I'll post quotes on social medias and whatnot, is Letters to a Young Poet by Rainer Maria Rilke, who was a Hungarian but German language poet in the turn of the century, so right before World War I. A lot of his books came out in that decade or two before World War I or a little bit after World War I. He's the best poet I've ever read. I reread his poetry all the time. His main ideas within his poetry and his letters are about God ripening within us. They are about allowing our experiences to transform us. He has this idea of blood remembering in one of his works, one of his lesser-known works, called The Notebooks of Malta Lord Briga. But he has this idea called blood remembering, where the events of our life, we must forget them and allow our blood to remember them and allow that to transform us. I think that's a beautiful picture of God's sovereignty. And this Letters to a Young Poet, the most famous idea from that, and the most famous idea of Rilke in general, is this idea that we must live the questions. So we have all these questions. What's going to happen to us later in life? Who are we going to marry? What's our job going to be? What am I going to be known for? What is going to happen tomorrow? What am I going to eat? And most of these questions, Rainer Rilke, most people just call him Rilke. Some people just call him the poet, right? Other poets, modern poets, will often refer to Rilke as the poet. So I know we don't probably know him in America, but he has had a profound influence on many artists. And again, this was recommended to me by Makers and Mystics, which is a podcast I really love, hosted by a poet named Stephen Roach. Letters to a Young Poet talks through, it's a series of letters, as again a lot of old books were, of an older poet, Rilke, talking to a younger poet, a guy named Kappas, talking through these pieces of life advice and him asking for advice on how to be a poet. But it's really just how to be a person existing in the world in a beautiful and beautifully present way. It's really, I think, and this is where like my philosopher mind kicks in, and I wish I could just move into hardcore academia sometimes. It feels like it's a very practical outworking of a lot of the philosophy and theology of Kierkegaard. What does it mean to be human and to live present in the midst of dread and sorrow? And so Rilke answers that in so many beautiful ways. And I forgot to mention where I heard of the other two books. J.C. Ryle, Holiness, was recommended to me by a guy named Joe Thorne and his podcast Doctrine and Devotion, which I guess maybe that's a Baptist I really respect. He is a Baptist I still very much respect. He lives life in a very, in a way of pursuing holiness, in a way of pursuing God's character for the means of enjoying Him and loving others. It seems to me. I've met him a couple times, but it seems to me from the outside that is way, and I think maybe other Baptists do, but man, we got some stuff to work through. And I know every denomination has issues, so I don't mean in any way to call them out. It's just what I'm most familiar with because it's where I grew up. Then when it comes to, that was J.C. Ryle, Holiness, and then Autobiography of Ben Franklin, I actually heard recommended by Vince Vaughn on the Tim Ferriss Interview podcast. Tim Ferriss, one of the best interviewers of our day, easily. No question. If I had to learn how to be an interviewer, which I kind of want to, I would watch Tim Ferriss and Stephen Colbert. Those are the two best of our day, I think. Colbert in a very different way, fun, lighthearted. Tim Ferriss, he does a lot of research. He knows what questions to ask to get really good answers. Ferriss interviewing Vince Vaughn. Vince Vaughn says Autobiography of Benjamin Franklin was the most influential book on his life, and I remember thinking, that's crazy. Vince Vaughn, you're just a stupid, funny actor. No, guys, he's a very smart guy, as any person who's successful at that level probably is. There are some exceptions, but probably is. Guys, I'm not going to go into my journaling. I don't know why I said I would. We're like 16 minutes in. You don't want to hear that. Maybe next time. I think with these videos, I'm always a little bit nervous that me talking about my life and how I view things will be a turnoff, or like, who's this kid? Who's this arrogant 25-year-old who thinks he has things figured out? I don't think I have anything figured out, so let me just throw that out there. So if this does just feel, a little superfluous, a little self-indulgent, let me know. But this has been stuff that's impacted me. Just thought I'd share that with you. So yeah, every time I sit down and I do this, I'm like, there's no way anybody wants to hear this. So if you do, just let me know, because I love doing it. Once I get into it, I like it, but it's hard for me to get over that bump, especially during the pandemic, when I feel like, man, I have so little to offer. I talk about that with my girlfriend all the time. I feel like I am not enough right now. Not that I really felt like it before. I struggled with anxiety before, but any sense of I can change that, it feels gone. Love you all. You don't need to prove anything to yourself. Let me tell you that right now. You don't need to prove anything to yourself. You don't need to prove anything to others. Live your life. I don't mean live it selfishly, but I do mean live yours without allowing other people to tell you how to live it. That doesn't give you an excuse for selfishness, but boy, does it free you from thinking that there's a right path. There's not. There's not a right path. Figure it out. And if you think there's a right path, you're probably on the wrong one. Ooh, hot take. So, anyway, I'm going to hang out with my girlfriend later. Gonna give her Christmas present. Pretty psyched about it. This was fun. Bye.